online registrations. Yeah. And there were 13.
All right. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Fantastic. Hello and welcome to everyone, both to those of you joining us in the room today in Amsterdam and to those of you joining us online as well. Happy Europe Day, everyone. Felt like I forced you into that woo, but anyway, I feel good about it. We are here for a very special day to celebrate Europe Day, to celebrate Europe and also to think about what it is and what it should be. In a second, I'm going to introduce you to the wonderful people that are going to be speaking here tonight. But first of all, we probably better introduce ourselves, Cats. We're going to be your moderators for this evening. So we are two of the people behind the podcast, The Europeans. It's a weekly podcast about Europe that we've been making since 2017. And I think the fact that we've been making it that long is a good sign of how complicated this continent is and just how much there is to say about it. I'm sure we're not going to get through all of it in the next hour and a half, but we'll do our best to have some very interesting conversations. So my name is Katie Lee. I'm one of the co-hosts of the podcast. I'm a journalist based in Paris. And here with me is my friend and colleague, Kat Laszlo.
Yeah, I'm Kat Laszlo. I'm a producer and occasional guest host as well of the show. And also based in Amsterdam.
And we're here to mark Europe Day. I've had a nice Europe Day. I came on the train formerly known as the Thalys, now the Eurostar, which actually worked properly. Yay! For a change. Felt like a very proud European.
That was a really enthusiastic woo.
And I wanted to ask a couple of you how you've been marking Europe Day. What did you do? Did you do anything? And it's fine if you didn't, because let's be honest, a lot of people don't even know it's Europe Day. Do a couple of people want to share their experiences of how this Europe Day has been for you?
We started celebrating from 10 o'clock onwards already this morning.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, together with 4 cultural organizations based in Amsterdam here, who all work on the European international level, we organized a series of events starting at 10 o'clock this morning at the Heart Museum, continue till 4 o'clock in this afternoon. So,
fantastic.
Looking forward to the next session again. Yeah.
Excellent. Anybody else? Do I have another hand?
I hesitated 10 seconds and then I thought I'm going to tell this story. I work in international health and I've been working the last 4 years with colleagues in Ukraine. A lot, of course, online, first due to the COVID, then on because of the war. And on Wednesday, I got a sudden phone call from Schiphol Airport saying, guess what? We're at Schiphol. So one of my colleagues with her husband, by very strong exception, got exception to travel into Amsterdam for 3 days with their kids of 6 and 9 years old for the first time in a long time. So these kids have been wandering around Amsterdam over the last few days. I've talked to the parents a lot. They're both very pro-European. And since I knew Friso, I immediately scored here this common ground thing. And so we just had dinner, and I gave them this, and she was almost in tears that she got this journal. And I said, we really need to shape up all of us together. So that is my Europe Day for today. I had not planned any of this. I had planned to go to all the events that you just sketched, but basically this was a Europe Day for me.
Oh, what a poignant story. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And today actually marks a pretty landmark Europe Day. This is actually 75 years today since the signing of the Schuman Declaration. The Schuman Declaration is one of those things that sounds really boring on paper. It's about coal and steel. Yay.
One of the many.
But I do think it's one of these things that, like a lot of things in Europe, it's one of these things that seems boring on the surface. And then once you look below it, there is a really powerful story there. This is this thing that, 1950, this continent was in ruins. We had just been through a devastating world war. And then this glimmer of an idea comes out to start maybe reshaping the way that we run things, reshaping the economy in a way that makes it much more difficult to fight with each other. And I think that's pretty powerful. Having said that, 75 years on, our future as a shared continent has never looked more uncertain. There are forces trying to pull it in different directions. You have nationalists rising in pretty much any country you look within the European Union, who want less Europe most of the time. And we're going to talk a little bit later on about how, you know, the EU flag is often waved as a symbol in countries outside the EU, and people outside the EU, further to the east, seem to be holding European values more preciously than the people, the lucky European citizens who actually get to enjoy them. What should we make of that?
Yeah, I mean, clearly Europe has always meant different things to different people. It's been changing. There are a lot of different ideas coming together. And today is about what does European unity mean? And also when our leaders are talking about defense, about military, about borders, about geopolitics, maybe what about a shared culture? So, can a large enough portion of Europeans come together and build a shared future is something we want to talk about. And even though there are plenty of forces that don't want us to have a shared future, can we pull that off? We also want to look at the more idealistic ideas of Europe and look at them critically, like something like the Schengen area. Is that really about freedom of movement, or is it about exclusion? A lot of big questions. How can we better apply the principles that Europe holds so dear is what we want to know.
We have some big questions, but we also are very lucky to have some very amazing thinkers to help us answer them. Tonight's speakers each bring a unique perspective on what Europe is, what Europe should be. Their backgrounds range from politics to art. They come from everywhere from the south of Europe to the east. Fundamentally, building any kind of unity between a group of people is about storytelling, right? It's about finding a story. Can we agree on a story that we all want to tell about ourselves together, that we all feel comfortable telling together? What story do we want to tell about Europe as Europeans?
Yes, so it feels very fitting that to kick things off, we will be hearing a story from the brilliant Başak Lej, telling a story about European ideals versus European realities. Then we're going to look at the political angle with Alberto Alemano, who is going to be thinking about the institutions and how we can make those more for and about the people. Then we are going to hear from Khatul Katavazi, a journalist who works in Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and she's going to tell us more about what the people around her that she interviews says about where the European borders are and what Europe means. And in the end, we're going to talk to two more brilliant thinkers, the Ukrainian artist Yulia Elias and the photographer Rob Hornstra, for a conversation about which Europeans we don't talk about enough. There's a lot of voices, and we're excited.
Before we kick things off, a quick word of thanks to tonight's organisers. None of us would be here without them, so thank you very much to Dutch Culture and the European Cultural Foundation. They are both partners in the new initiative Domo, which, if you haven't heard about it, it is Amsterdam's new shared space for culture exchange. It's going to bring together all of this amazing cultural expertise under one roof, which is pretty cool. And we would also like to offer our thanks to the European Commission Representation Office in The Hague for their support for tonight's event. All right, should we kick this off?
Yeah, let's kick it off with a story. Could Başak Lej come to the stage? Başak is a theatre maker, storyteller, artistic director, a lot of titles, born and raised in Istanbul, now based in Amsterdam, weaves together personal and political with a healthy dose of humor. Looking forward to that. I think we could use it. You can often see her performing at Mezrab, the Iranian storytelling house, and she's also one of the driving forces behind Reederij Lampedusa, which organizes tours around Amsterdam on boats that migrants have crossed the Mediterranean with. I can really recommend. Yeah, let's go.
Hi. Do I want to stand there? I've never done that before. This is a look. All right. Normally I use my hands a lot, so I prefer actually to do that.
Go wherever you like.
All right. Oh boy. Hi. This is a different venue for me, I'll be honest with you. All right. Okay. Give me a second. Well, tonight I'll share a few stories with you, but I would like to start with a love story that I grew up with. It's between a boy named Turkey and a girl named Europe. You see, this boy loved the girl, absolutely loved, adored her, and he just wanted to be with her. But the girl, she had some notes, right? She was like, well, maybe first get a haircut, right? Find a better job. And the boy tries, he does his best, but, sometimes he goes back to his old ways. It's not easy to change, But after each of his small victories, the girl brings up a new challenge, a new rule. Like, why are you wearing those stupid pants anyway? And you should stop hanging out with those troublemakers. Go find yourself better friends. So this goes on like this, a dangling carrot of love. And one day, the boy can't take it anymore. All those broken promises, heartbreak, and the weight. So he goes and dates the girl's rival, her evil competition. In our case, Russia. But even though my country gave the finger to Europe, after trying to get her ideological panties for many years, I never lost hope. No, sir. I always wanted to live in a European city. I would imagine myself living in a small apartment with a French balcony, and I would plant some flowers on it, and I would have a small bike with a little basket up front, and I'm carrying a baguette wherever I go for some reason. And in this story, I'm way thinner, with dimples on my cheeks, and I wear pastel-colored skirts, and I never, ever have morning breath. And also there's free press. So when I moved to Amsterdam 7 years ago, I had this European dream, this story in my head. And a lot of people along those years, they asked me, why? Why did you move in here? Was it for love? Well, yes, there was a man involved, but it was mostly for hate. I moved to Amsterdam because of the Voldemort of Turkey. But to be honest, maybe call it childish naivety or stupidity, but I thought my life would be easier the moment that I moved in here. But that wasn't the case. First, there were the visa problems, then the work permit. I just found myself in this Ouroboros of bureaucracy, And after waiting for 2 years, when I finally got my work permit, I said, let's go. Now it's time. I had studied media in Turkey with a full scholarship. I'm not saying it to brag, maybe a little. But to be honest, I thought this would make a difference. So, and even though a friend of mine actually told me that she was from Turkey, and she said she applied for all those jobs, never heard of anything, until she got married and changed her surname to a Dutch. Then she got all those offers. I was like, that's your story? It will be different with me. So I knocked on all the doors that I was supposed to. Advertisement agencies, film sets, creative offices with exposed brick walls and ping pong tables. And I didn't hear anything. And it was not only nothing, but the worst was sometimes this rejection behind this fake smile. This smile, I could swear, maybe it was my paranoia, but I could swear that I could hear murmuring with this breath steeped in matcha latte and passive aggression, saying, oh, you think you belong here? And behind my own fake smile, my breath steeped in Iran and swallowed rage, I would say, good luck playing ping pong without balls, bitch. I was jobless, aimless, just wandering, walking around with ping pong balls in my pockets. And and to be honest, behind my rage was very thin, because I thought the problem must be me. Because this European dream, this story that I was told, passed around like a bedtime tale, told me that Europe was the land of equality, dignity, opportunities, questionable cuisine, but democracy. Europe, where the stories had happy endings. So if I wasn't thriving, that must be my fault. So I started working at Horeca, knowing that my day would come. And I carried koffieverkehr back and forth for 2 years. Alsjeblieft, mevrouw. And they would say, where are you from? And I would say, Turkey. And they would say, oh, but you don't look Turkish. And I would say, thank you. I thanked many mevrouws like that in those 2 years. And I never understood why. Why I was so ashamed of my ethnicity. Why I was so trying hard to blend in. The answers didn't come to me back then. But my Horeca days came to an end when I found myself on a boat at Reederei Lampedusa. Now I'm going to tell you their story. But first I'm going to get a bit of water. So, Reederei Lampedusa is a social organization based in Amsterdam. And the story goes like this. An artist, Dutch artist, turned Castellan, goes to this Italian island, Lampedusa. And in that island, there's a part that's known as graveyard of boats. Because all those boats that carried people across the Mediterranean, oh, wow, yeah, that's it, exactly. That carried people like fleeing from wars and violence, and he saw those boats like stacked on top of each other, and he decided to bring 2 of them here to make a statement. So he did that, and since then, these boats are actually carrying people, like organizing canal tours, and this crew just consists of refugees, and those refugees tell Amsterdam's history, but through the migration lens, and how Amsterdam was actually built, shoulder by shoulder, with Dutch natives and refugees for hundreds of years. So they approached me, they asked me to be a recruiter, and to be very honest, I didn't imagine myself working with refugees when I moved to Amsterdam. You know, I wanted to leave that brown world behind and wash myself in whiteness. But here I was, talking to people, you know, fled Sudan, Eritrea, Uganda, Iraq, and Syria. And the more I listened to them, the more I realized something. The story isn't just what we tell. It's what writes the rules. It's what slips in your psyche, determining how you see yourself, and how the world is built, and who gets to build it. A team member that I talked to, she shared a story with me. Now I'm going to share her story with you. I asked her permission. She said yes. This person, she was Palestinian, and she grew up in a Syrian refugee camp. She was stateless, as Palestinian people are. But she was very bright. So she started working for UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And it was kind of ironic because she was a stateless person and she was working for the resettlement cases of refugees. She said it was tough, but she said she felt like she was helping to people, right? Even though the war in Syria got more harder and harder, and even though whoever could leave left, she wanted to stay there. And it was also good paid, she said. But everything changed for her. One day, an Iraqi family came to her. This was a family of 8 people. And so this family, their religious sect was different. They were Sunnis. That's why they saw a lot of violence, harassment, rape. One of the sons got shot on his leg by a sniper. So it was horror after horror. And that horror didn't come to an end when they came to Syria. So this team member said she was sure she could find them a country to resettle. So she conducted their interviews and she sent the papers, but then they get a rejection. And when they asked the reason why, the reason was this. Authorities looking at the family's ages, they saw that the mother gave birth to the eldest son when she was still a minor. So they said they were afraid once the mother resettled in this country, she would push the same ideals into her daughter. Let's unpack this. Here is a family who faced many horrors, right? This should face many horrors, and now they're seeking for a resettlement. This should be the story. This is the story. But instead, authorities, instead of focusing on the horrors, they zoomed in on one detail. Mother gave birth when she was a minor. And from that moment on, they wrote a new narrative. And in that narrative, she's not a survivor anymore. She's a potential danger, a cultural threat. They question the possibility of future behavior wrapped in moral superiority and focuses on cultural assumptions. And this was a turning point for my teammate, because she saw that she wasn't really helping people, but she was just watering a toxic soil based on discrimination. So she quit the job, and the war got worse and worse, so she decided to ask refuge in the Netherlands. And now she was sitting at the other side of the table. Now she was giving answers. She was trying to convince the person why she needed a refuge. She stayed in the asylum-seeking center for 1 year. And she said in that year, actually she helped many men and women to reshape their narrative. Not because they were liars, but because she knew in her previous job, one of the biggest reasons that those rejections come because of credibility. And credibility means that you should have a proper outline of your story. And that story should be told in certain ways. But that's almost impossible, because human brain doesn't work that way. If you have a traumatic experience, human brain does everything. It loops and dodges and just walk around the wound in order to survive. So she said actually she helped more people in that 1 year, helping to reshape their stories, than she did in UNHCR for 6. And I heard many stories like that. I can tell you many, many stories like that. And these stories really, they show how this system is built in discrimination and violence awaiting at borders. And officials and refugees alike drowning in this sea of regels and regels. And more stories I heard, the more I questioned the myth of Europe that we were told. Because guess what, Europe? You won. You told the story so well, we believed in it. We jumped fences for it. We crossed oceans for it. We left everything behind for it. And now we are here. And from the inside, it's not an ideal place. Europe is a velvet rope. The story doesn't hold anymore. It's time for a rewrite. And not from above, but from the below. From the kitchens, from the borders, from the boats, from the sea. And not out of revenge, but because truth needs new authors. EU slogan is united in diversity. Cute. I have a better one. Yo, we are working on it. We are far from being perfect. We have our prejudgments, our blind spots. And we are sorry for putting false ideals into your head and playing with your sense of self. We are sorry for flaming wars in your regions and turning our heads away when the consequences come at our door. But we want to do better. Not all of us, but some do. And we cannot do it without you. A bit long, right? Maybe those ad agencies were right not to hire me. Turns out I suck at slogans. But I'm a storyteller, and I know a story that needs a rewrite when I hear one. Thank you.
Basharan, that was amazing. Thank you so, so, so much. I can't think of a better way to kick off an evening that is, after all about rewriting that story and working on it. There was plenty of the political in Basharan's story, but now we're going to switch focus a little bit and focus just on the political for the next part of the evening. Our next guest is Alberto Alemano, a repeat guest of the podcast The Europeans, and for very good reason. As I was just saying to Alberto, I hope you don't mind me saying this. You're one of these people who you never say exactly what I think you're going to say. You always bring the surprises, and I really like that about you. You are here despite being one of the busiest people in Europe. You are the Jean Monnet Chair in EU Law at HEC in Paris, the founder of the Good Lobby, which does amazing work in Brussels, trying to empower civil society to have more power in the policy-making process. You've worked with everyone from the EU Commission to the OECD to the WHO, shaping policy on everything from whistleblowing to voting rights. Your academic roots range from Harvard to Bocconi. You are a public thinker, published in Le Monde, The Guardian, Politico. I am running out of breath here. Despite having a very packed schedule, Abota said that there was nowhere he would rather be than with us tonight here in Amsterdam. So we're very, very glad to have him here to join us to test some of his ideas on how citizens can reclaim this idea of Europe. Let's give a warm welcome to Alberto Aramano.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you, Katie, for the kind introduction. A bit bombastic. Expectations are very high. I'm going to do my best in telling you potentially a different story and unveiling something you probably already know. The European Union was established in the absence of Europeans. Behind Jean Monnet, during that speech, and Robert Schuman, you referred to that declaration, exactly 75 years ago, there were not many people. It was an affair by governments. They were all male, they all looked the same. And they simply said, that's what is good for Europe. And they just made it happen. And the idea behind it is very simple. It's this idea that in Europe, democracy is for the people. The EU is there to deliver for the people. And people are going to be accepting, as a result, any kind of result. They don't need a say, right? It's a trade-off. You're going to deliver, you're going to let you okay. And this has been going on for a long time. We call it permissive consensus. So democracy in Europe has never been democracy by the people. It's not this idea of having participation. It's not about democracy of the people with representation, right? Our governments sit down on our behalf. This is where we come from. So I have a question for you, a question I've been asking around Europe for a few years. And nobody really gave me the answer I expect. And the answer to that question really has to come from some thinking, right? What Europeans never do together. They do a lot of things, right? We do business, we travel. There's a lot of economic interdependence in Europe. There's a lot of free trade, fresh products, apples, any kind of agricultural policy, CAP things happening, a lot of subsidies getting into it. We celebrate across Europe. There are a lot of tourism. 14% of the Spanish GDP is about that. Wow, it's huge. It's very high. We also play football together, very high level. European teams get in there. We get together as couples. We have a lot of people, mixed couples, you can see them around, getting more and more. You all know that more than 1 million kids were born out of Erasmus. And if we had many more programs, there would be many more people. So even Viktor Orban would be proud of us. There would be many more kids around it. But there's one thing that Europeans never do together. And I think I've been hinting to the fact that Europeans never do politics together. Politics, it's a prerogative of the nation state. Think about the European elections that took place 5 years ago, exactly 1 year ago, in May, right, in June of last year. Think about it. What happened, right? You, the Dutch, many of you are Dutch, voted on Thursday. Some other people voted on Friday. Some other people voted on Saturday. There's no Europe's election day like they have in the US. We vote for national parties. We vote for national programs. We vote for national candidates. The Dutch vote for the Dutch, the German for the German, the Slovenian for the Slovenians. And we kind of normalize that is European politics. But there's nothing European in it. It's about national politics expressing some potential orientation about what happens in Europe. And it's totally crazy that we normalize this idea. Again, there's nothing European into this. European elections are the result of 27 parallel elections, asking different questions to different people, getting different answers. And the question is, how do we aggregate all these responses in a political majority that allow the Commission, the EU, to speak with one voice? It's just impossible. It's mission impossible. And this explains why today Ursula von der Leyen Commission has 2 parliamentary majority, depending on the day. Sometimes they look at the centrist country, the centrist parties. Some of the time they said, the R rights is useful. We're going to have a plan B. I challenge you to find any other country in the world where one government can rely on dual majority coexisting one with another. It's a recipe for confusion, it's a recipe for inaction, and that's exactly what the absence of a European political party system produces. Think about those elections. In those elections 1 year ago, you were confronted with ballot boxes that were only presenting the logos of your national party. There were no logos of European political parties. There are those calling the shots at the European level. So I really challenge you to find those European logos. These are national parties presenting themselves in Europe without telling us who they belong. Are they pro-European? Are they centrist? Are they conservatives? We don't know. So take the example, right? If you're a German voter voting for CDU, how many of German voters know that when voting for Mr. Merz, they're voting for Forza Italia, for Républicains, for Mitsotakis in Greece? And how many of them know they're actually supporting three very different parties, who, by the way, they are all sitting in the very same party? I'm referring to CDA, BBB, and CC. Three very different parties, all insane in Europe, but of course fighting here all the time. How do we explain this? It's just not intelligible. What is the link existing between your preferences here and the political color of the European Commission? There's no readability. Why should we vote for the European election? I'm trying to be provocative here. If there's no result stemming from it, right? No surprise, there is no European public sphere. How there can be a European, pan-European conversation around politics if this political conversation has been hijacked by national political parties? They keep all political cleavages within the borders of the nation state. It cannot be otherwise. It cannot be different. When a political leader speaks up in Europe, that story will be narrated in 27 different ways. Regardless who is, there is the prism of the nation state telling that Mr. Orban has been saying one thing. And we already know what the Hungarian media are going to be saying most of the time. It's right, predictable. That's what he's really asking for. So who is accountable? Who is accountable for issues ranging from the rise of housing prices in Europe? It's happening everywhere, but who is responsible? Are the cities? Are the nation states? Is the European Union? What the Union can do in those circumstances? What about climate inaction? Who is accountable for it? Who is accountable for inflation? Who is accountable for the state of the rule of law? The fact that judges in Europe, they no longer trust one another, and we are squeezed, because if you get a judgment in a country that is not really fair with the judges of the country where we are, they're not going to recognize each other. There's no longer trust. That's a deep thing that is really affecting our life. And this outcome is problematic for a variety of reasons, because it is against the law, but it also carries a lot of unintended consequences that my previous speaker has been highlighting in a very magnificent way. Because if you are not able to understand people's preferences, how we can provide credible answers to all kinds of Europeans that are currently members or have been waiting in line for a long time. This is just not possible. You have Eurobashing. You have this habit of national political leaders to bash the EU when in the capital and saying different things when they are in Brussels, and they get away with it all the time. They get away in spending 5 years setting up a thing called Digital Service Act, and then the case study to use the Digital Service Act, which is Mr. Musk providing support to AfD, for instance, doesn't lead to any result. There's no political will to actually use that instrument. And it can go on, and on. We spent 5 years building the Green New Deal, and we spent 6 months to actually undoing it. And nobody's really saying much about it. So this lack of a European political space is possibly the most neglected explainer of what is wrong today. Virtually everything we see happening in Europe or not happening in Europe has to do with the fact that from a logical standpoint, we are not aggregating political preferences across Europe in a way that is clear enough to legitimize European action. Nobody has this democratic input that we often call input legitimacy, this idea that people should be behind you. Otherwise, how can you justify your action? And the answer has been output legitimacy. We're going to deliver. This is going to be enough. No. This is over. Nobody believes that. It's not possible, because today, as a result of this, we are deprived of our idea of governability. We as Europeans, we as residents of Europe, we are deprived from this belief that actually we can decide of our history. We can rewrite our history. But if we are not putting the conditions to do that, we don't even try. Not even when we get a wake-up call every week. I don't know if you have noticed, but Europe gets a lot of wake-up call. Everybody agree, we get wake-up call. You know, if you get many wake-up call, you get woke, and then you don't do much. You get tired just because of this European moment. And I see a lot of this happening. But the world is in fire. So how can we Europeanize politics? And I'm coming to a close by simply saying that I spent my last year of sabbatical, you know, when we academics have the privilege to be paid to read, to think about what could be the Europeanizers, which are the drivers for actually making that political conversation happen. And among the ideas that I developed, you have a very simple one that has been discussed for a long time but never really happened, that is basically saying, why don't we start electing European representatives across Europe on the same day, based on the same political parties and based on pool of candidates that are going to be run all across Europe. The direct result would be clarity. All of a sudden, a Dutch person will know exactly what his or her vote means in Italy and vice versa, in Portugal and in Slovakia. Everything would become readable. Everything would be all of a sudden something that could be translated into action or to inaction. Why don't we start asking people at the same time what they think about an issue? Are we ready to support Ukraine further by arming it? What if you ask Europeans all at the same time? We had over 70 referenda on Europe at the national level. We never had a European-wide referendum happening at the same time. What would have happened? What kind of difference would have made? What about associating a citizens' assembly, randomly selected citizens, to the Council and the European Parliament? People who all of a sudden would have the chance, as they try in a couple of pilots that were run, to actually have a say. And these people feel all of a sudden empowered to actually say, oh, there are expectations that I can potentially have a voice and get a voice in that issue. What about dedicating a percentage of the entire budget of the European Union, which is 1% of the entire GDP, to participatory budgeting? Citizens expressing preferences on how 10% of that budget should be used in one way or another. Why don't we start using these fantastic avenues of participation? Petition, European Citizens Assembly. We've never been using them. It's incredible. European Citizen Initiative allows 7 citizens coming from 7 European countries to ask the Union to do something, and we have become very skeptical about it, very skeptic. But you know what? We only register 100 in 13 years. We don't even know how it works, the instrument. What if instead of having 100 ECIs, we had 1,000 or 1 million? How different that outcome would have been? How much more serious the EU institutions and leaders had started taking their own citizens? What if we organize and we register 50 or 100 ECIs with the best possible ideas we expect from Europe, all at the same time? Will it be possible for our political leaders to disregard? I doubt, but we never tried. So this is my call. The call not necessarily to wake up, but to actually potentially think that now is the time we are expected to take the decisions, because these expectations are there. We're going to be widening. We're going to be deepening. There are challenges coming from the East. There are challenges coming from former allies on the West. We see that the EU is retooling, is very reactive instead of being proactive, is moving away from a community of values to a strategic geopolitical actor. So it's changing nature, it's changing skin. And it cannot do this without having citizens on board. So this is really the moment in which either the citizens on board or the whole thing is going to crumble. Because the EU can ill afford not to receive some form of democratic legitimation from the bottom, especially because we expect the EU to do more. So the gap between the power exercised by Europe and the power left in the hands of the citizens will actually increase. And this gap is going to become much more significant. So Europe is not only up for grab, but Europe is something we can and we should co-write every single day with our actions. Because at the end of the day, Europe is us, is what we do or not we do every single day. And this kind of awareness alone should render us very optimistic and just say, let's continue building and continue our journey. Thank you so much.
Look, you finished on a quite optimistic note, so I'm going to be a negative Norman now and bring down the mood and be cynical and unimaginative and ask you, okay, what do you say to people who say, fine, you think part of the solution to this big problem that we have with EU democracy is making a genuinely European politics, a sense of us actually having a stake in what happens across borders. What do you say to people who say, I don't really want any more politics. We already have enough politics in our own country. You're asking me to do loads of extra stuff. I don't want to do it.
It's very difficult to pitch politics as a solution to problems today. But if you think about it, historically, it is the political. It is only the political conversation and the political space as the art of the possible that identifies scenarios and allow everybody to be part of something bigger than that. And I think there is passion for politics in Europe. It's a different passion. It's not electoral politics that make us excited, but it's about ideas, visions, and I don't think we have enough of them. So we need to populate that space. In a way, we suffer from a sort of intellectual laziness when it comes to Europe. We don't create enough ideas. There are not enough ideas circulating that really make people spark and think. So how can we generate more idea production around the future of Europe? And in a way, we're all facing a crisis of imagination. We feel so stuck in our day-to-day. We take for granted a lot of things we do. So overall, we don't feel pushed to think imaginatively. But we have been doing this for many centuries, and that's what the human species is able to do as compared to many other animal species. They cannot just project themselves into the future. So we have this beautiful talent that we are simply not using. And politics, historically, is that space to allow you think and vision and bring people along. So I keep asking this counterfactual question of how Europe would look like if we had imagined it a bit more, with more ideas. And again, this is the job of politics in one way or another. It's big politics with a big P, capital P, but it's creating spaces like this one, generating ideas well beyond the electoral cycle and beyond the election.
I'm going to prod a little bit at your argument. And this division between national and European politics is something that I always find that we talk about in a bit of a flawed way. Like, I see the complications, but then I see, a Rutte or a national leader saying, Europe made me do this. And it's always really frustrating because I'm like, you're on the European Council, you were there, you were in this meeting, what are you talking about? And then it doesn't say in the newspaper, this is not true. Or there's no sort of fact-checking or context. And then on top of that, there's the European Parliament, which has the national parties in there. And I guess I find that a really missing part of context that most people, I think I didn't really understand that until we literally made an explainer about how the EU works. And I thought, now I get it. And I guess, how does that change or complicate, or how does that influence your argument?
Well, my little theory there is that if we see this separation between the national political conversations and the European one, is because our national political leaders have been extremely skilled in nurturing the fiction that these are two separated words. Because in a way, structurally, they are really in control. They decide who gets into Brussels when they make the European Parliament list. They decide what is the national programs. And therefore, that means that it is the national political classes determining how much of the European political conversation is getting into our land, into our political space. And they love to be in control, and they remain in control. But then crisis and shit happens in life, and then all of a sudden they gather, and out of need, l'Europe se fera par des crises, there is a crisis, we come together, Europe needs us, and you move on. But then you keep these very national cleavages well kept from possible Europeanization. So very quickly, from a conceptual standpoint, it's fascinating to see how the initial idea of European integration as developed by Jean Monnet, but also by theorists like Ernst Haas. He was an American. It's incredible. American thinkers have been contributing more to European integration theory than Europeans.
Uh-oh.
There is one guy called Ernst Haas who basically said, in 10 years' time, The Unity of Europe, wonderful book, 1958. He already saw everything. He said, in 10 years' time, things are going to go so fast because of interdependence and spillover effect, one crisis after the other, that inevitably the residents of Europe, they're going to stop looking at the national capital and they're going to start shifting their allegiance towards the central body, which is the new regional actor, which is the European Union. So in 1968, he wrote a paper saying, I'm so disappointed, it's not happening. Why is not happening? Because the further integration did not lead to democratization, because there was no Europeanization. People were not exposed to what this regional entity was doing. Everything was narrated. You go from the empty, it's called the empty chair crisis, 1965, all the way to the Nice Treaty and all these treaty changes until the December 2020 summit, in which Viktor Orban and the PIS-led government push the European Council to act as a legislator by basically saying we stop everything because we need to make sure next generation you and all this money are going to get there. And it's the same pattern. It's about national politicians hijacking the regular course of European integration in order to remain in control. And I call about an hijacking. It's an hijacking of the original idea. And this is really holding us back. But it doesn't work all the time, because sometimes the very same national politicians are going to be judged not only by their constituencies, but they're going to be judged also beyond the border. And that's the moment in which, national politics and European politics is the same. But it doesn't last long. Then they regain control and they build the walls again and they regain control. And I think it's really about saying what you said, which is, the emperor's clothes. Somebody has to say. We say in Italian, il re è nudo. It's the same idea.
Like everything, it sounds better in Italian. I promised the organisers I'd be very fascistic about timekeeping, but I'm going to be naughty and ask you one more question. When you started talking, you described the EU as this fundamentally elitist project. It's not really democracy. It's not government by the people, certainly. And in that, I hear this little nugget that sounds kind of familiar from what I hear from leaders like Marine Le Pen and Viktor Orban about how the EU is a fundamentally elitist project and it is not for people like you. Do you think that little grain of truth is part of why we've seen populist parties do so well across Europe in recent years?
It would be a big jump to argue that populism in Europe is a result of the hijacking, so I'm not going as far. But certainly, if you think about it, is undisputed that the European integration project was designed at the table by white male discussing about how we get together. But the idea that I'm trying to instill into you is that after a few years, there was an expectation that democratization would have happened inevitably. So there's nothing inherently anti-democratic in the European project, but we render it anti-democratic. And that's why it matters today, because we are 70 years after. The level of integration, social and economic integration in Europe is unprecedented. We have approximately 4% of the population living in a different country than the country in which he was born. But we also have another figure which is much more significant. And I ask you, how many people do you think in Europe are exposed to another European country on a yearly basis? So once a year they travel, they cross a border, or they have family there, they have kids, they have parents. How many? 50%. So Europeanization is happening at all possible level, but one, the political one. So unless the political Europeanization catch up with the reality of Europe, we all face, consciously or unconsciously, we're all shaped by European decision-making as much as by the one happening in our nation state. So unless we acknowledge this, we cannot really make a progress. So there will be a moment of truth. And there are so many challenges facing Europe that I think the moment of truth is very close, very close. From defense all the way to housing, so issues that are exogenous to the European Union, which are endogenous, all these issues are happening all at the same time. And this will force us to actually expect more from our political leaders and to think in terms of transcending their borders. It's not going to be good enough to reach solutions. Might be wishful thinking, but I think we are close.
I look forward to talking with you about this in 10 years. See what happens. I have no idea. Thank you so much. We are ready for our next guest. next up we have Khatul Katavazi, a freelance correspondent from the Southern Caucasus, reporting on Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. She writes from Tbilisi for The Correspondent, De Groene Amsterdammer, Word Vervolgd, and many more. Khatul is also the co-author on a column called Opinion Across the Border in Trouw, where she reflects on perspectives of on Europe's evolving meaning from the Caucasus. Yeah, glad to have you here.
My first day in Tbilisi so well. Tbilisi is the capital of Georgia, for who doesn't know it. It was the summer of 2022. I stood outside my hotel and looked up at the mountains that surround the city. The trees were full of figs and grape fruits. A stray dog lay in the shade, all very peaceful. And then I noticed the wall behind it. In big red letters, Russians go home. That wasn't a one-off. I'd soon realized that every walk through Tbilisi felt political. Anti-Russian graffiti everywhere, a reaction to the more than 100,000 Russians who had fled Georgia after Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But not just that. On buildings you'd see NATO flags painted, EU flags hanging on every governmental buildings, from ministries to schools, but also in restaurants, in nightclubs, even on farms in some remote villages. And I was mesmerized. As a journalist, it's my job to write about the world and what's happening. But in Georgia, I felt like I was living inside the headlines. Soon I understood why. Georgia is a small country in the Caucasus, just south of Russia. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it went through a civil war and extreme poverty. But ever since it got back on its feet, the country had one clear goal: to become part of the European Union. Because Georgians understand their reality all too well. They are a small nation living next to a giant, aggressive neighbor. And that longing to join the EU, while being so close to Russia, puts Georgia in a very difficult position. The country is stuck between two major powers. So when tensions rise between Brussels and Moscow, they rise in Georgia as well. So you can probably guess how things are going there right now. A year after my first visit, I moved to Tbilisi. Georgia had just been granted EU candidate status, and I expected to find myself in a hopeful country. But soon after I arrived, I found myself in the middle of mass protests, the first of many to come that year. The demonstrations were against a bill the government just introduced, what people called the Russian law, because it resembled a law passed in Russia back in 2012. In short, it gave the government power to silence NGOs and independent media. Tens of thousands of people took to the streets, night after night, waving EU flags and dancing to the European anthem. Later that year, after the ruling party claimed victory in deeply unfair elections, and then announced it would freeze Georgia's EU application, the streets erupted again. Night after night, again, central Tbilisi turned into a battlefield between police and protesters. The EU flags were still there, but so were tear gas, water cannons, and police brutality. Over the course of the year, I spoke to so many protesters, dozens, if not hundreds. I asked them, why are you protesting? Why risk your safety, especially since more and more protesters were being arrested? And why wear the EU flag? And again, they would say the same. Because I want to live in freedom. Because I want my children to grow up in a free country. And for that, we need the EU. To be honest, before I moved to Georgia, I wasn't that interested in Brussels. I'd skip most EU-related news, found it quite boring, to be honest, a very Dutch attitude. And I was mostly critical. When I thought of the EU, I thought of its colonial legacy, the inequalities within the EU, the closed borders, the refugees stranded in the Mediterranean. And I am still critical. But Georgia showed me that that's just one face of Europe, an important one, but one face, and that there's another face too, one that's worth fighting for. If you ever get the chance, I would urge you to go to Georgia or to any other country on the edge of Europe. It was there where I learned what press freedom really means when I interviewed local journalists risking everything to tell the truth. Or when I met a 23-year-old bartender last December who'd been protesting for weeks. He told me, I am not into politics, I am not an activist. I just want to go to a bar, dance in nightclubs, don't go on dates. But instead he was out there every night protesting. It taught me what freedom really looks like, not having your life disrupted by forces beyond your control. For me, the story of Europe today is the story of these two faces. One of freedom, human rights, and solidarity, and one of xenophobia, exclusion, and fear. And with all the conversation we're having about the future of Europe, I think this is the most important one. How do we live up to our own ideals? I remember driving through the newly opened borders of Bulgaria and Romania earlier this year when I drove with my car from Tbilisi to Amsterdam. And I read an article about border controls being reintroduced between Germany and the Netherlands to scare off refugees. Around that time, two Polish thinkers, Karolina Wigura and Jaroslaw Kuis, wrote that Western Europeans have forgotten what open borders truly mean. For those who once lived behind the Iron Curtain, open borders are not just a convenience, they are a symbol of freedom hard-won. Maybe that's the question Europe should be asking. Not just how to defend itself, but what it wants to defend. Because what use are weapons if the far right keeps gaining ground? And to answer the question of what we want to defend, I believe it would be helpful to listen more eastwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khator. That was great. I was very moved to see the protesters in Georgia waving the symbol of this thing I'm a citizen of. And I also found it very jarring at the same time, because obviously you don't see that in EU countries. There have been all of these moments over recent years where you thought, okay, this could be a unifying moment for people that live in Europe, in the EU, whether it's COVID, we all had this shared experience of this terrible thing, and yet we came together in various ways that were really important. Or, even much more recently, you have Donald Trump threatening our continent, and you'd think maybe that will be this moment where we galvanize and we come together. None of these things really seem to have led to anything concrete so far. Maybe I'm being a bit negative in saying that, but so far I don't see much. What do you think it would take to make that kind of unity happen?
As we see in Georgia, you mean?
Yeah, that kind of thing.
I think when you look at Georgia, the reason why people go out on the streets and risk so much is because they have this fear that if they don't go out, they can lose everything. I spoke to so many people who paint this picture that if they don't go out on the streets, it's all or nothing for them, because their fear for what their future would otherwise look like is to live in unfreedom. And I'm not saying that that is the point where we're at right now. I don't think that our democracy is at stake yet. But what we could learn from Georgia is to maybe look at our fears. And there's so much happening around the world, with autocracies rising, with strong men that are growing in the US, in China, and Asia, in Africa, and those trends we see happening in Europe as well. Perhaps we should see these bigger trends that are happening as guidances towards what we do want. We know now what we do not want. Let's use this fear as a guidance to stand up, to have talks like what we're doing right now.
Oh, I would love to ask you so many more questions, but we're running out of time, so we'll just ask one. Do you think EU citizens are aware of how they are seen from the outside of the EU, and do you think that's changing?
I think the question should be more about if we are aware of the privileges that the other people see. And I'm talking from the perspective of Georgia. You know, Europe has been seen differently throughout the world. There's also parts of the world that don't really care about Europe. But talking from... What? Yeah, it is true. Talking from Georgia, I think when they think of Europe, they think of how lucky we are that we have governments who are not corrupt or not that corrupt, that we can live in freedom, that we can vote and know that the elections will be fair. And I'm not sure if we realize that all too well in Europe, and if we maybe take it for granted.
Yeah, I'm starting to see the girl from Bachelan's story as increasingly spoiled. I think she really does have some work to do here. Let's bring a couple more people into conversation with you. Thank you so much for that, Gatol. From Bashak's reflections to Alberto's thought on reimagining citizenship, we've already heard some great ideas this evening on redefining and potentially reclaiming Europe. But Europe's stories are shaped by what we see and what we are allowed to imagine. When you close your eyes and think of a European, who do you see in your head? And, well, maybe does that need changing, that idea of an archetypal European? So that's why in this final conversation for this evening, we want to discuss how art, photography, and indeed journalism can shift Europe, shift its borders, shift where we think of its center as being, shift Europe's very sense of self. So joining us, along with Gatol for this conversation, are artist and activist Julia Elias. Her work reclaims the narrative around Ukraine, using ideas around decolonization. It's super interesting work, but Julia, I'll let you tell everyone a lot more about your work, because that's going to be a lot more interesting than any way that I could put it. And also joining us is photographer Rob Hoornstra, who is known for his powerful long-term visual storytelling projects across Europe, the Caucasus, and Russia, including, funnily enough, a project that is confusingly also called The Europeans.
Scandal.
So we have all of the Europeans here with us tonight. You're our rival, Rob.
Competitors, I think.
Ooh.
I've
No
been
beef here
expecting you.
Well,
I've got some news. Is this working? Do you hear me? Since today, so you can't do it any longer, since today we managed to register theeuropeans.org. Yes, I think you're all jealous now, not only you, but also the European Cultural Foundation.
I want you to leave this panel.
It's very difficult to get that domain.
how much did you pay for that?
Actually nothing, just being friendly.
Damn it. Okay, we'll talk about this later.
Yeah,
I think we should
we'll pick
move
it
on.
up. You can get ours, which is theeuropeans.fm. Fits more to yours.
It's true, radio-based. Anyway.
It's also a shady move.
Is it? Is it?
Let's bring down the tension, everyone. All of you here on stage with us now are people whose work focuses on parts of Europe that are very far away from Western capitals like Brussels or Paris or wherever. I would like to start by asking each of you in turn, how does that focus away from Western capitals shape your work? Julia, why don't we start with you? I think you need to turn your microphone on.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Yes, so my work is based on the topic of representation in the Western art institutions, and how we tell stories about where I'm from. I'm from Ukraine, and how we shape and how these narratives actually impact the decisions. So my work is a bit in this liminal position. I'm not really talking about Ukraine. I'm talking about experience of being Ukrainian in the Netherlands, and how art institutions represent our stories, and which stories are heard and which are overlooked. Yes.
Rob, how about you?
Oh God. It's about people outside capitals and etc. That's what you were asking, isn't it? So, within our project, but maybe I have to explain a little bit about the Europeans, the project I'm working on, because I expect that not everybody knows it. Together with a writer, Arnold van Brugge, I'm working on a 10-year project which is called The Europeans. I'm a photographer. And what we do, we try to make a kind of timepiece, a document of Europe in times of drastic changes. That's also how we announced this in 2019, times of drastic changes, and that's a period. That was a moment, 2019, that people were looking at us and thinking like, what are you talking about, drastic changes? We just had a Brexit, but how important is that? Currently, we don't have to explain what kind of drastic changes we're actually talking about, and we think it's important as storytellers to preserve this period of time for future history. If you imagine, if you are looking to bodies of work from the 1930s to the 1940s, you immediately connect that to the things that were happening afterwards. And that's why we think it's so important to document this time properly. We are focusing as well on this long-term ambition, but we also have short-term ambitions. And you see images now, but I have to explain these images as well, so I really need to speak fast, I think, because this is a fragment from our project. And we focus on the periphery, that's how we call it, the periphery of Europe, the places where usually the news doesn't come from, the places that are not capitals, the places that are not tourist resort, the places where people just live, work, do their thing, and feel very often neglected. And the reason why we go there is because we had the feeling, and we still have the feeling, that these are also the people who think differently about Europe than I do, than we do, than the people here in the room probably do. And we want to understand better where it comes from. We want to understand better where these ideas emerge. And I think you can, living here in the bubble where we like-minded people live in, we can come up with all kind of assumptions, but it's better to ask the questions directly to these people. And for me, in the past 5 years, I've learned so much. I so much better understand now where all the anger and the fear and the whatever comes from. I still have to learn much more, but that's what we try to translate in these stories. And these stories is something we try to bring to you, but also to other people, of course, to the people in the periphery, for example. Is this an answer to your question? I don't know. I just explained a little bit about the project.
No, that's great. Thank you so much.
You.
And finally, Khatal, we've heard a bit about your work already, but something I find really interesting about your work is that you are writing about people very far from Western Europe, but your audiences, you work for media that are mostly here. Does that shape at all, I don't know, are there like stereotypes that you feel like you have to avoid when you're writing this kind of thing?
I think when you write about Georgia and about the Caucasus, but mostly Georgia, is first of all to explain to the Dutch audience that it's a country and that it exists and that there's people living there. And also in the last decades, journalists that were writing about Georgia, they were usually living in Moscow, writing about Russia, and they would fly into Tbilisi and then write one story about Georgia, but always with this Russian lens in it, you know? So to me, it feels like an assignment almost to change this narrative about Georgia. And I see this happening more and more since the war in Ukraine, where I think the same has happened for decades as well. And it's been changing now in the way that people are more curious to know what is happening in these countries and who is in power in these countries. And they are a country itself without, you know, this big neighbor, Russia. I don't know, does it answer your question? Yeah.
Yulia, I wanted to ask you, because you're the co-curator and editor of the Ukrainian decolonial glossary, which applies post-colonial theory to the Ukrainian context, very practically to language. And I'm wondering what kinds of assumptions about culture, language, and geography still need to be unlearned in how we talk about Ukraine here?
Yeah, I would join you with this statement. We can share like this experience of like being misunderstood and looked at through the prism of Russian lens, through the prism of Russian language. And this is what happened. The problem is not only like imperial Russian like expansion and that they want to control the territories, but also the structure within the art institutions and the universities. Traditionally, they had like so-called Sovietological studies, that after the Cold War changed to Russian, so like Soviet label was changed to Russian label, and simply what happened that people who were working in these institutions, they had less funding because like Cold War, like the end of Soviet Union, no need to research these territories any longer. And and then all these former states that were part of the Soviet Union, they had no narrative, like there was no academics, right? Of course there were like local academics, right? But they were overlooked, and the network of people were always through Russia. So this is something that we need to unlearn, and one of the methods is basically to go and to speak to people what Rob is doing and to hear their stories firsthand, and not to have like this, kind of patronizing narrative imposed on top of you. So just let people speak and tell their stories. Yes.
I believe there's a painting in particular that you wanted to talk about. Perhaps we can show it on the screen. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Yeah, it's a long story, but I will try to keep it very short. I wanted to put a bit of a perspective to this conversation. This is the painting of Oleg Tistel that was presented in Stedelijk Museum, Amsterdam in 1991. And this was like a group exhibition initiated by Stedelijk. They gathered together Western artists and artists from Eastern Europe. 1991 is when Ukraine became independent. This is when Soviet Union ended. And the Wim Bern, director of Stedelijk, asked artists to imagine future of Europe. So when I was invited to this conversation, I was immediately reminded of this work. And this exhibition was not very successful because the artists that were coming from the West, like famous artists invited to the show, they were not very interested in thinking about the future of Europe. While Eastern European artists, like they show a lot of enthusiasm and they wanted to tell their stories. Yeah, and Gilbert and George, for example, they just sent already made works, so they didn't want to engage in this conversation. And this is what Oleg Tistel proposes. He paints this mural. This was a bit a format of the exhibition, paints this mural of Ivan Mazepa. And he presented here 3 times. Oleg Tistel is a very interesting artist. I have to give you a bit of a context, bear with me, about who Ivan Mazepa is. Ivan Mazepa is a Ukrainian hetman. And usually people asking, like, what is hetman? Is it like king? Not exactly. So hetman is the leader of the Cossacks. So Cossacks, they were serfs that escaped their feudals, and they built in the 17th century Ukraine, they built their own government structures along the banks of the river of Dnipro, and to protect themselves. So they had an army. And hetman was a democratically elected leader of these people who were seeking freedom. So, Oleg Tistel depicts this hetman Ivan Mazepa in the famous battle for Poltava. This is another context, right? Like how is it related to the Netherlands? Through Tsar Peter, who traveled to Europe for this 17th century Erasmus program and learned a great deal of, was very inspired of what Dutch people were doing here. And when he came back, he decided to start his own empire. And he needed access to the sea. And that's why he started the Great North War. And this is the end battle of this war. And in this battle, Ivan Mazepa chose not to align with Peter, but he chose to align with Sweden, with King Charles XII, Karl XII, I'm sorry. So, and this is what happened. And he had a vision that we could be together as a European. It's called Mazepa's Europe. Like this vision, I watched today a talk of Oksana Zabushka, our famous writer. She also talked about Mazepa, and I was like, this is the sign. I should really So he had a vision of united Europe, that people, the states can coexist together as a partners, as equals, where we can exercise our differences. So this is a collective of diverse identities that can coexist. And this was a proposition of Oleg Tistel in 1991, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I'm bringing it here today for you as a sign, a hope. We got independence, and he painted him like 3 times, because it's like a history that is reoccurring, repeating itself. But also, I might think, I don't know exactly, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, he might also talk about the different ways how people depicted this figure, because for Ukrainians, Mazeppa is national hero. He is present on our money. He is our part of our identity. For Russians, he is a traitor. And for Europeans, there is a different story. He is a highly romanticized figure. Byron wrote about Mazeppa, and he wrote about his love affair story, that he was basically in relationship with a married woman, and then her husband found out, and he tied him up to the horse and led him to the steppe. And this is when Cossacks found Mazeppa, and he built his career from this low point in his life. But basically, this is a bit of, the historical figure that has a very different incarnations in different contexts. And when you bring it back, it makes history more interesting rather than, plain stories about greatness. And I wanted to say that a proposition for Europe is not, we can imagine alternative futures, and maybe we can search for these alternative futures in the dead ends of the histories of the countries we have no idea about, search for inspiration from each other. But also, it's not about what Europe is, but it's about what Europe is for sure not, right? Mm-hmm. We know for sure that what President Trump is suggesting is not something that we want. We know for sure that what Putin, this, divided world with 4 sphere of influences, this superpower narrative, this is we definitely do not want. But what we want, we want to celebrate our diversities together, and this is the future of Europe for me. Yes. Thank you very much.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for that, Yulia. Rob, turning to you, in your photography, you have documented the lives of Europeans who don't tend to get represented in the media. What has that taught you about what our blind spots are? What tends to get missing from what we're seeing?
I think that nowadays we very much are living in our own bubbles, leading to the very frequently used word polarization. And the thing is, every time after elections, we, I assume, left side semi-intellectual part who is present over here, we are shocked to see the results of elections, which is a clear clarification for me that we in this audience as well do not know what's actually happening in, maybe the large majority, the vast majority of our country, or maybe in Europe. And that has to do with the fact that we don't meet up with other people, that we don't talk with them. And you can imagine all kinds of different bubbles that we don't talk to. For example, if I ask over here, it might be a misassumption from my side, but who's going to a mosque to talk with Muslims over there? I think it's not very many people who do it, although we have millions of Muslims living over here in the Netherlands who might have different ideas than you have. going to farmers, for example, and have a proper conversation with them, asking them questions. I don't know actually if you do it. The good thing about my job is that it forces me more or less to do it. And that's super insightful and that's super helpful. If we go to the fishermen in Den Helder, for example, where they had a fleet, it's disappeared right now, then we hear stories, clear explanations why they will never ever vote for a pro-EU political party in their lives. And they can explain it in such a clear way that I sympathize with them, that I start sympathizing with them because I understand they are being more or less their business is being killed by misregulations from Dutch governments and EU policies. So if you hear all these kind of stories, then you start understanding like, okay, we think we should be a unity in Europe, but I think we first have to start working on cohesion between the people in Europe. That's very important. And that's not happening. And I blame us as well. It's not them who don't cooperate in this important matter, but it's us. We also don't cooperate. And the worst example of all are the politicians themselves. They create this way of this polarization. They create the tensions between all those different groups. What we try to do, summarize in our project, is to contribute a little bit to depolarization in Europe by telling stories, but also giving a voice to all these people who do not feel heard in the periphery of the country. So, for example, to give you one example, if we make work, we do not first present it in a capital city, which for me as a portrait photographer is super easy because I can have exhibitions at art fairs, in museums, etc., etc. But why would I do it? It's speaking to you once again. Whereas it's maybe more fair to first speak to them. So we present the work first on the place where we make it. And then we have a conversation over there to ask them and to hear from them whether they think that we see it, their visions, in the right way. And if not, then we have to correct it. So that's very important, to give them a voice and also make them feel heard. And them, in this case, is all the people who are, well, not present in this audience, who have different ideas than I have. The other for me, but I'm the other for them, of course. So I think that's so extremely important, and we all have to start working on this, to start talking to other people, to walk into a mosque. They're here in Amsterdam, and they invite you. You're welcome on particular days, of course, but yeah.
I do sometimes wonder, I think it's an awkward thing to address, but I do sometimes wonder how much we might actually disagree in this room, or it's a question you don't ask very often, but I'm actually really curious what everyone thinks here. Maybe.
Do you think we disagree a lot in this room? I think we all agree.
I've got no idea.
That's frightening in a way.
Yeah.
There's one question.
I don't feel I belong in European Union. Although we are in the European Union for such a long time, although that we are example around the markets to use the European money to increase our potential. So I think in the whole kind of conversation that's very, very romantic here, we should also stop stigmatizing ourselves. Because I coming from the country that was very often in the jokes, you know, it was always the joke that Polish people steal the cars from, and you might laugh, you know, I laugh by myself, but then you coming from this country in Netherlands, and Yulia, you probably can feel this as well as a Ukrainian, right? Yeah, my voice almost shakes, sorry. I feel I kind of should feel belonging here, but I cannot even imagine. Right now, Ukraine is under the war. I question how you're going to treat Ukrainians if the war stops. I hope it will stop soon. That's my question. Like how we treat Europe, how we treat ourselves, and who feels like it's coming from the better countries, and you would vote for them because you trust them more.
Julia, did you want to come back to that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. This is the question of a hierarchy of power, hierarchy of knowledge, and this with the project of like the colonial glossary, this is something that we try to address. But also, I have to say that the colonial theory existed before, like we started to work on it, of course, and it's coming from a different context. So it's basically we are looking for the ways how to address these inequalities in the academic field and the museum. Of course, I cannot answer you like how to undo xenophobia in Europe, and it's all valid concerns. And of course, there is already, like part of my work is a humanitarian work. I work with refugees from Ukraine, and there are various situations that are happening, and to them already, even on the level, I will use this opportunity to say it now, but even on the level for Ukrainians officially, it's not allowed to register as a ZP, right? So you can basically go and do this to the KVK, and if you have like an address and you have like the BSN number, so they will open the ZP for you, but we don't know what will be the consequences like later on in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time. There is a lot of, it's a different question, but the displaced people from Ukraine, they are facing discrimination, and there is like hierarchies in who gets, like the question of education, right? Our kids, they cannot get university studies for the same amount of money as Europeans. They have to pay as non-EU students, and they are coming from the refugees background. And so my work is twofold, right? The romantic story about the museum is more like a visionary question, but of course there is like day-to-day work that needs to be done, volunteering work, humanitarian work, and it's like a second part of it. But if we pause in today's celebration of Europe and try to think about affirmative solutions, because what is the alternative if not Europe? I don't see it now. I don't see it now. So like it's better to be in this mess and try to figure it out, rather than to be part of, I don't know, Russia, or like to be, and you know, like what is happening in occupied territories, like,
It's more about the feeling. Like Poland was never on the table, either after Second War, either with European Union. We were never at the table. Although we were just the closest neighbor fighting, and we we never had the saying. So we, like for a long time, we were not, and even now with our just refreshed government, we are not treated as a kind of equal, And I just trying to give this example, and it's not only from me, it's like from other countries. Gabriela can speak for herself as well. It's more like, they are not equal thinkings of different countries. It's different thinking about France. It's different thinking about Germany, and after Germany, all of the East is stigmatized about like we doing something wrong, or we are caricature of the European Union, and we're still trying. But I don't think so. We should try so hard because we already prove ourselves so much.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for flagging up. We've spent a lot of time this evening. I'm conscious that we spent a lot of time speaking about what it's like to be in the EU versus outside, but of course, you're right, you're completely right. There are all of these hierarchies within. We saw with the financial crisis, the way that Greeks, for example, got talked about. It's the same kind of thing. So we can agree, I think, at the end, wrapping up, coming to the end of this really great night of conversations, that there is plenty that needs fixing. As Bashar says, how did you phrase it? There's work to do? We're working on it? We're working on it. Let me ask all of you this before we wrap up. What would you like to see change? If you could see one thing change before the next Europe Day, what would you like it to be?
I want to a war end. I don't know. This is like the only wish, like that. But also, it makes me, like your comment also make me think that sometimes the problem is that the way how we think about we belong to each other and to certain communities should be somehow always positive and fixed, you know, but this is not how it should be, because sometimes we need to assimilate and be together and talk to everyone, and sometimes we need to separate and to heal and to be among people that we know and love. Sometimes we need to start a revolution, you know, and advocate for change. The problem is when you're stuck in a specific mode. You have to switch like a clutch in the car, you know, and not to stay fixed. And sometimes know and feel and understand the context, because there is a moment when you kind of fight and complain, and there is a moment when you assimilate and celebrate each other's differences.
Oh, yeah, a question or a comment?
A comment. I'm also Polish representing, but I'm not going to complain. I just had a thought, because I've been going about the Europe and very quickly. I have if I was ever on this citizen for the Europe, I would have lobbying very hard about bringing a new law in the European Union and in Europe and maybe the whole world to bring primary education knowledge about the European Union. Because you were saying that we actually didn't know how the European Union works. And it actually starts in a primary school. That once a week we have 5 minutes what the European Union does for education, how does it work? And I think that would change the Europe from within. If you start early, there's 1 million people from Erasmus, you know, children born, use the third culture. The young kids who grow up with 2 different cultures, help them, but also they go to the schools and talk, you know, how it is to grow up with 3 or 4 different cultures. So that's my sort of wrap-up for the evening from the audience.
I really like that as a concrete thing that could change before the next Europe Day, so thank you very much for that. Rob, what would you like to see change?
I think it's a very good idea, by the way. I think I already mentioned in the previous thing that I've said, but let's make it very concrete. What I would like to... Let's just keep it to ourselves. So within the next 7 days, within the next week, we are all going to have a conversation, and we ask sincere questions to someone who's not part of our bubble. Someone on the street you don't know, and just start a conversation and start asking questions. How he feels, or what she does, or those kind of things. I think that will, in the end, really contribute to having a better European Union, Europe, world, maybe in general. And that's really necessary, rather than staying behind our telephone, staying in the bubbles on social media, staying in the bubbles in these kind of audiences, staying in the bubbles that are so comfortable to stay and to judge the other. But let's have a conversation. That's what, in my opinion, should change.
I'm going to give you a piece of homework as well. Invest in your knowledge on countries in the EU. And I agree very much with what the Polish woman in the back said. I lived in Georgia, and over there people also are, there is this T-shirt which is really popular in Georgia. It says, "I am Georgian, and therefore I am European." And it says so much that they feel like they have to convince themselves and us that they're part of Europe. And the reason for that is because the people that define what Europe is are so much centralized here in the west of Europe. So it would help so much to learn more about what people in other parts of Europe are saying.
Thank you for that. Interrupting my colleague. I would love to wrap up, and I really like staying with that question of what would we each hope would change in the next year, and also what we can do. I think it's such a strange moment where we all feel... I had coincidentally a conversation with complete strangers yesterday that was an hour and a half long to a Mexican couple who'd lived in Amsterdam for 10 years. And we were talking about how powerless we feel thinking about this stuff. And meanwhile, we're living in one of the richest countries in the world, and how crazy that is. So I really like the idea of sitting there and thinking about what we hope to be different in this imperfect union that is Europe, to steal it from the Americans, and and what we can do. Thank you all so much, panelists, guests, people in the audience, my colleague Katie and friend, for a really interesting evening. If you don't want to dash off, you're welcome to stay for a drink. If you want to have a European nightclubbing evening, go to the Paradiso, where there is all kinds of things happening until crazy hours in the night.
Apparently, I'm going to be on stage with some of these guys at midnight, which, as a 6-month pregnant person, I'm really excited about. And I'm definitely going to say clever things. No, it's going to be great. So please do come along. It's going to be a lot of fun. They've also got, if tonight has made you feel like dancing, which maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. Paradiso? I'm not in Amsterdam. And where is that? Is that near here?
Everyone knows.
Everybody knows. But the team at De Kiesman have put together an amazing night. There's DJ sets in the main hall of the basement, small stages featuring conversations to give you a break from the dancing, including some of us. So yeah, check the timetable on the screen and come join us.
And one last thing, we will not be forgiven if we don't mention this amazing annual magazine from ECF, Common Ground. There are copies all over the place. Please take it home with you. And thank you to everyone. Have a nice night.
Thank you so much, everyone.